everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe Moore here, joined by Joey Lichter, a professor at Florida International University in Miami, in the chemistry department. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited to be on your podcast. It's a beautiful day out here, so yeah.
I'm excited too. So I think, is it the case that we only met in person for the first time at Psychedelic last year?
Yeah. Your team came to the rescue and really helped us out. I am the faculty advisor for our FIU Psychedelics Club. We were working on an event with some local organizers at our university, and at the last minute, the university decided we weren't necessarily an internal event because we had these external coordinators that were involved, and I think there was more to it than just that, but we were running low on support, on funds, and we did this crowdsource, and somehow we got in touch. You guys really helped, and it was a great event, and we did get to meet, which was great.
That's right. It was our mutual friend, Los Arias.
Yes, Los,
right.
who's a alumni of Florida International, yeah.
Oh, yeah. He's great. So, yeah, we did that. Got to meet the following year at the larger Psychedelic, and then, that's we've been in touch a few times before that, though. You're, I think, famously one of the few professors in the United States teaching about psychedelics in the university setting. It was, what was the gentleman's name? Oh, Jerry Brown. Was Jerry Brown in Miami teaching psychedelics even like earlier?
This is a great story, is that when I started teaching here, Jerry had literally just retired. He was professor emeritus. And so we didn't really know each other much until I put together the Psychedelics Club put together the conference, and we knew that Jerry had taught a course on hallucinogens here since the 70s. And it was through the anthropology department, and it was pretty popular, but by the time I started teaching, he was already, I think he's living in Portugal maybe. So I feel like I kind of took the torch from him a little bit and started something a little different, right? Because my approach is more chemistry and health than, say, anthropology. But I do think that it's important to note that Jerry was really one of the few people in the country teaching about psychedelics through the 70s and 80s, really.
Yeah, I think from what I understand, he was one of the first. He might have been the first. Who is the other guy? The guy that wrote Mind Apps?
Tom Roberts, maybe?
Yeah. I think he might have been competing with an early education, the undergrad angle.
And Tom is great. Tom, there's a group of us that are doing this, that we connect. We have a group that's called the Psychedelic Educators Network, and we've met a few times. I think everybody, it's hard. Being an educator means that you have too much work and not enough pay. But there are a growing number of psychedelic educators that are in different departments with that intention of trying to make sure that we're getting college students a proper, balanced, evidence-based education. And you have to think about it too, because the future doctors, future therapists all have to go through college. So if we can get them at that young age where they're starting to learn how to really study and learn, it's just so important.
So how did you come about having an interest in actually teaching the course for students? Did you bump into Jerry first or something, or?
No. In fact, it's completely separate from Jerry. Just a little bit about me. So I'm a chemistry professor, and when I was in graduate school, I was studying drugs, but mostly viral drugs. So things that were targeting things like HIV or herpes, and they were these certain class called nucleoside analog drugs. But when you learn drug mechanisms and the biochemistry of drugs, it's applicable to almost any drug, right? There's receptors, there's competitive binding, non-competitive binding, etc. And the cool thing about graduate school, to any of your listeners that might be interested, is that besides learning how to do research and to read, a lot of programs have seminar series where they want the graduate students to sort of interact with professional researchers, to consider people to work for in the future. And I took that opportunity multiple times. I invited a lot of speakers when I was at Emory. And one of the people I invited was David Nicholls, who at the time was the chairperson at Purdue, studying serotonin receptors. And this was about 2006. So really early in the Renaissance period. I mean, just, the Griffiths paper probably just came out.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was just so curious about what people were understanding about the mechanisms of these drugs. At that time it was still very young. There was no crystal structures of the serotonin receptor. There wasn't even really N-bomb and stuff like that designed yet. A lot of that stuff was still the analogs that Nicholls had made. A lot of them were MDMA related, LSD related, but still hadn't gotten into the things that made it eventually into the late 2010s or early 2010s. But anyhow, I developed a great relationship with him, and I was considering when I graduated to go work with him because I saw this as fascinating. Just there's this area of chemistry, but also consciousness and potential therapy. It's just it's a beautiful meld of so many things. So when you're a student of that, you can't just be spending your time with the periodic table or just spending your time learning about neuroscience. You gotta have to do everything. And so I stayed in touch with him, and when I graduated, I looked at jobs and I thought, psychedelics are likely not going to be a financially viable future for me. And funny note that in the documentary Dirty Pictures about Sasha Shulgin, Nicholls is featured, and the first thing you see of him in the film is talking about needing money for his research. And this is around that time, 07. So I that was the vibe at the time in research. Like, who's going to fund psychedelic research? Who's going to hire me to do that? So I knew that I could teach because I was really good at that. And I came here and I started teaching chemistry. In 2019, I became the director of our pre-med program, which gets me working closely with the pre-med students. Yeah, and it's a great group of students. They come for advising, figuring out, what they need to be successful, what schools they should go to, what programs are good. And around 2020, right before the pandemic, the Honors College was doing a call for new courses. And I said, it's always been on my mind to continue my interest. And this would kind of force me to get back into the fray of reading the papers, of staying engaged. And so the honors, I presented a curriculum that would cover everything. It covers the chemistry, it covers the history, indigenous use, 20th century, journal club for today, and we pack it all in 3 months. And I presented it. I remember the day that I presented it too. I felt like going up against the firing squad. You always feel, with psychedelics that there's still villains, in the world of anything. But those who were involved in the curriculum choices said, yeah, it sounds good. And so I started doing it in 2020. Done it for 4 years. And just recently, the liberal studies department got word of it and said, it's unfair that our general population can't get access to this information. Could you design something for the general audience? And, especially given that Jerry's course is, I'm not even sure he's teaching it anymore because he's emeritus. We decided to open up these sections through liberal studies. And we do 2 sections. We do a fall section on the fundamentals, understanding the history, and then, believe it or not, we have the spring semester called Psychedelics Today, Therapy, Ethics, Legal, and Policy, something like that. And I know, I know that you guys probably would appreciate how much we actually lean on your podcast and show episodes, and so what you're doing is actually reaching my students. So it's great. It's great.
Yeah, that's super cool. And I love hearing that. So let's talk about education and educating these folks, right? Like, there's how I like to think about this, Joey, is we're digging ourselves out of a very, very big hole of propaganda from DEA and elsewhere. I think, $50 billion is probably not an understatement in terms of total drug war spend. That probably includes D.A.R.E program spend. And there were a lot of explicit lies in the D.A.R.E program, right? Probably leading to people getting hurt and or killed and or addicted to substances, right? So how do we now shift and say, here's the data, when conservative people in institutions are kind of against it in a lot of cases, right? Like, I was chatting with somebody with at a really big California university yesterday, and they were nervous to even host a small talk on the topic.
Yeah. Yeah, the first thing I would say is that finding people at institutions that align with the current state of things is important. And that's why I started, it started here at the Honors College, where many of the, first of all, the dean of the Honors College is very progressive. Many of the courses, approach things from a multidisciplinary, approach. And so you gotta start there, where you have allies in understanding, because really it's not that you want it's not that we want to automatically shift the pendulum to say, no, we need to teach a class that psychedelics are all great. That in itself could be dangerous, right? So what we're trying to do is tell people that there needs to be a full story presented. We were talking about this before the episode started, that we have sex education in high school where, we've moved away from saying don't have sex till you're married to saying, this is what happens when you have sex. You can have a baby. And these are contraceptions that you can use. These are the types of STIs you can get. These are the rates of them. These are the decision making that you can make that's not so good. This is what it takes to raise a child. We've changed the education and not just say no to sex, but understand the entire process and what goes along with it, and be understanding. And so with drugs, especially just the 80s, where it was just say no to everything, we need to have this new education that says, just be responsible with the way you think about these things. And there might be times when these things are valuable. There might be times when these things are not valuable, And we have such an emphasis on set and setting in this course. In fact, we use the book by Ido Hardingsson called American Trip, the set and setting of the 20th century psychedelics. And it's so important to understand education in terms of set and setting. The mindset, when we discuss MK Ultra, for instance, great point. I have to tell the students, you've got to understand that the Cold War mentality made the perfect storm for our government to kind of think that this kind of stuff was okay. In retrospect, we can see how terrible and egregious the experiments were done, but they have to understand what the mindset and the setting was at the time to really learn this material properly, right? And I think that's where even today they have to see that we are in a hype bubble with psychedelics and understand what that means. That means the hype bubble probably exists because we're seeing some really cool things happen. We're seeing great research on psilocybin and depression and MDMA and PTSD. These things are definitely showing results. Are we going to see the same thing with psilocybin and anorexia? Are we going to see the same thing with LSD and generalized anxiety? Maybe, but we can't let the hype, you know, overshoot our recognition of the importance of evidence and doing things scientifically. So the education has to be about being balanced, being aware of where we are. Um, so yeah, there's a lot to it. There's really this. I think the more I meet with other people teaching, it's how do we get our students to see all the angles? You know.
Mm. And how many angles are there? It's like a little intimidating as an educator, from my perspective. I consider myself one, and it's daunting how much needs to get covered. So someone has like a somewhat reasonable, broad perspective on the topic, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and from an intro perspective, like, hey, we only got 16 weeks. Like, that's a lot of material to cover
Yeah.
in like a relatively short time, honestly.
Well,
So,
and when I
mhm,
started teaching it,
mhm,
um, I didn't even consider ketamine a psychedelic,
mhm,
and I had to understand that in the years since I considered maybe going into psychedelics to when I started teaching the course, things have changed so much that there's been reorganizing how we view drugs and redefining the term a bit, so it's not necessarily just that they look like serotonin or they're pharmacologically similar, but that they can create these alterations with some potential for therapy or for mystical experience. And the ketamine piece is so interesting to my class. Spravato is showing excellent benefits for acute symptoms with depression. But then at the same time, you look at it, it's like, wow, we have got a brand new pharmaceutical drug that is turning into a money making thing, right? And is that the direction that we'll see things like psilocybin and MDMA go? Are we going to see these commercials like we're seeing now for Spravato during our Friday night television? There's a lot of just things are moving fast in directions that are maybe not even understandable. They change so fast that it might be something you thought you understood today, and tomorrow it's different.
totally. I want to dig into the Spravato thing because this is actually a great opportunity as you're a chemist to talk about it. So, is it disingenuous to say Spravato is a brand new drug? Like, I was chatting with somebody from the FDA recently about this, and like kind of almost scoffing a little bit at the recent warnings from the FDA about ketamine, because they're acting as if they have zero knowledge about psychiatric use of ketamine, when in fact Spravato is just a slightly filtered ketamine. It's a very similar molecule. It's like the same molecule, just a slightly different isomer. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the S isomer. That's why it's referred to
Yeah.
as S-ketamine.
Yeah.
They didn't go too far out from naming it based on the stereo isomer.
Right.
But you can get the mixture of the R and the S isomer in the IV treatments, which gives a different experience, a different length of time of the drug. Um, and yeah, ketamine's been around since I think the '60s. Early use was really with veteran from Vietnam, and then they recognized the power that it had. They used it with animals, and yeah, it's been around for a while. So to suggest that it is a new drug would be disingenuous. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like troubling to me that the FDA can kind of get away with that, but it's this is what we're fighting, right? We're doing education, so you can say, "Oh, look, here's some bullshit from an organization that used to do a lot of harm to us in this space, but they're." I'm told they're not being bad actors from the inside. They're just political animals, and they have to do a lot. And federal agencies are really prone to lawsuits so they're really careful. So drive me nuts to have to operate that way, but like I understand from to a degree.
Well, and I also think, even though the FDA has a history, there are new people that are working in the FDA, and I know, I just was talking yesterday in class with Dr. Albert Garcia Romeo from Johns Hopkins about how the FDA is considering, pushing to get cannabis scheduled to 3 instead of 1, and they're really pushing for it now with all the research that we're seeing with cannabis. So there might be people in the FDA now that are not necessarily in the same mindset as those who were there 20 years ago, and hopefully they can work with researchers to make the right safe choices on how we advise for certain compounds. But it's definitely time to deschedule most of these things in Schedule 1 that have been showing medical benefit.
Right. So Dr. David Nutt, I assume you guys talk about David Nutt's harm scale from like '09 in the Lancet
Yeah.
in class. Yeah. Like that's one of my foundational pieces. I've not seen enough published critique of it in journals to like know what was responded to there, but largely it came out funded by the UK government with the intent of working towards science-based drug policy, right? And people wanted, well, he was fired promptly after it was published because it said alcohol was the most dangerous of all the drugs he studied, right? And it's the least penalized and the most celebrated culturally. So he's hitting a few taboos. Like, how do you like to think about that scale, or what do you teach about that David Nutt harm reduction scale?
Yeah,
Or
that's
harm reduction scale, harm scale. Sorry.
no, that's a good question. I think in our classes I teach about psychedelics, so I emphasize that in terms of abuse potential, we know that psychedelics do not have the physical addictive capability, and we talk a lot about mechanistically why that is. We know that there's tolerance that builds from taking things like LSD, and so because of that, you can't necessarily do it every day, and the experiences are often described as challenging. It's going to be unlikely that somebody is going to want to every day face their demons in a row. I don't know that I spend a lot of time discussing alcohol or other drugs, only because it's not in my wheelhouse. And the students, there's so much to grasp with psychedelics themselves. I think we just get into, we do look to see like what are the greatest, what are the reports of the greatest harm from psychedelics. And so we've looked at studies where there was a woman who thought she was snorting cocaine, and she snorted a crystal of LSD, and what happened to her as a result. And we talk about the fact that there's really not the same level of toxicity that you see with a lot of other drugs. That you could definitely die from a heroin overdose. So yeah, I don't know that we have too much about every drug, just because I only have 3 months with some of these classes.
Oh, of course. Yeah, it would be like a painting with a broad brush, right? I guess how I lean on it is look at how safe these two molecules are, LSD, psilocybin, relative to all these other ones that are so common in culture. So I start there, and then I say something like, I think paraphrasing David Nutt, who said, if we're going to make a science-based drug policy, everything safer than alcohol should be decriminalized immediately, and we should examine all these other drugs as well if we're going to be, actually doing culture in a somewhat scientific fashion. And I appreciate that.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time discussing legalization and decriminalization. I think my students, when they come in, and this is an important point, that I deal with kids that are sometimes 18, 19 years old. They don't really have a grasp on some things that maybe you and I the words
Mm-hmm.
just immediately give us, the definition. So we talk about decriminalization and legalization, and the young people are pretty quick to recognize that putting somebody in a jail cell because in their pocket they had something that somebody has said is bad is way different than putting somebody in a jail cell because they stole a car or they harmed another human being. And then we talk about the percentage of people who are arrested for drugs that tend to be disenfranchised communities. And, there's a lot to be said about psychedelic education melting into, to criminal, the investigation of the criminal system and how that works, and whether or not it's actually doing better for society, right? We talk about Portugal where they've got drugs decriminalized and they don't have, this rampant, overdosing problem or health crisis like we have here. So maybe these things are part of the education, is thinking about how we can at least remove some of the criminalization first before we then think about what context could it be used, whether medical or religious, etc. But that's a very key piece to, I think, my courses, is getting to that point. And if we can teach enough people that the criminalization of drugs is really not bettering our society, maybe we can move towards utilizing our police forces for more important things, for helping people instead of putting them in jail if they have a drug problem. A lot of times people end up with drug problems because of where they live, because of their family situation. It's not because they necessarily want to be a criminal. They're probably trying to deal with life situations, and life can be hard.
So you guys, you and El Garcia were talking about Rethinking Dare recently, and the Dare program, drug abuse resistance education for those who are not part of the United States. It was I think I took these classes in 5th or 6th grade, probably 6th grade. And it was interesting. I was very enthusiastic about trying LSD and probably PCP. I said, look how strong I can get. And oh, that's interesting. At the same time as I'm getting exposed to like gangster rap for the first time. So I'm like, oh, cool. This is fun. And then they brought in people with like drug abuse problems to like talk to the students. And I recall the worst thing you can ever do is try LSD. And I'm like, oh, okay, interesting. That's the only one I ever regretted for the rest of my life. I'm like, oh, fascinating. So, it didn't work super well on me. But like, what do you like? I think it's explicitly a harmful program in that it breeds ignorance and actually, at least historically, was filled with misinformation. What's your read on the history and maybe like what we could do better?
Well, let me first say that the cool thing about being an educator on psychedelics is that the psychedelic community is so small that when I first reached out to Al and I said, Al, I know you're from Miami and we have some mutual friends. Would you come talk to my students? He has been a regular visitor. When he comes down to Miami, he's met with some of the students. We've gone out to dinner with him and his sister. He spoke at our event, and so I have so much appreciation for how some of the researchers really understand the importance of getting to the college kids, and for the students, when he came and visited yesterday, he was on Zoom, but when they walked out, they were buzzing, they were like so happy, like, wow, we met somebody from Johns Hopkins who's doing this stuff, and I had them ask him questions, that they read some of his work. So it was a great time to have him in the class. So he and I both grew up in Miami, and so in Miami the D.A.R.E program is still happening. We asked my class to raise their hand if they had been through D.A.R.E, and about 5 or 6 of them said yeah. And I think the issue is that it comes out of the 1980s, out of the Nancy Reagan years of just say no to drugs, say no to crack, all this, and everything got lumped together, and it needs change. And the hopes, and I think this is what we were talking about, is that some of the researchers who are doing this work and some of the educators that are doing this work can reach out to the leaders of the D.A.R.E program and other drug education programs to talk about ways to incorporate what we know. So LSD and psilocybin may have some excellent abilities to help people with certain mental health disorders. It may also be dangerous to take copious amounts at a music festival if you are not feeling comfortable, right? Having the conversation about when can it be good and when can it be bad, that's where I think we would really like to connect with people. And if somebody is watching your podcast today who's in the drug education world and wants to team up, give me a call. Let's talk. If we reach to young people and teach them about responsibility, um, you know, the expectation that young people are not going to want to get high because you tell them to is probably the most absurd, idiotic thing. The general consensus is that when you're young, it's a good time to get high because you don't have too many responsibilities. So go ahead, experience it, and then later on in life when you're dealing with mortgages and kids and stuff like that, it's a little harder to carve out 8 hours of your day to listen to Dark Side of the Moon with your friends.
Mm-hmm.
But because we know that young people are going to be doing it, we need to teach them about drug testing. We need to teach them about, set and setting. We need to teach them about risks and the potential that if you do have underlying psychiatric disorders, pushing too hard could potentially be the catalyst for that. And we don't know enough about it, right? We're not, we still don't know enough about what causes the catalysis of a psychiatric disorder from a drug use, but we need to have people be aware that things could happen.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even like under discussed issues like HPPD, right? Like there are people who have issues for a long period of time after psychedelic use. And because it's such a small proportion of people, there's no funding to go to this yet. I'm hopeful that I can help kick some off. I've got a few partners that want to dig into that too, and I know people that have had it, so it's pretty intense. And it could be a simple resolution. We just need to actually dig into it with a little bit of gusto. Like it's not, in my opinion, not forever. But yeah, so there's just so much left, and I like to give case studies, right? Like kind of, I've spent a lot of time recreating, right? I'm like wearing a fish hat right now, for instance. So like, I got to see a lot of bad behavior that put people in ugly spots through the recreational lens. And it's the folks largely that don't take breaks, that don't say, hey, I'm going to put this down for a couple months or a year.
Do you know that
the
first semester that I taught, I reached out to Leonard Picard, and he had just been released, and I told him I had read The Rose of Paracelsus, and I think it would be neat for you to come talk to my students. And my students, I had them do the research on him, and they were like, oh my God, this guy, he's got such a story, he's going to come talk to us. And you know what he told my class, and it's always stuck. One of my students said, what is the greatest lesson you've learned about it from LSD? And Picard said something along the lines of, the greatest lesson I've learned from LSD is how beautiful life is sober, right? Like the recognition that these experiences are supposed to give us more life itself, not make us want to keep chasing, more kaleidoscopes or whatever, more drug experiences, but to help shift wherever we were prior to our experience, and then jump back into the real world with more wonder and excitement.
When I recorded with him in right outside Santa Fe, New Mexico, at Synergia Ranch, we really got into it, and I let him go, and he kept saying very similarly. He was calling it the natural mind, like how beautiful the natural mind is, and he's become a serious meditator. And I don't disagree, and I often think that's the point of us using psychedelics, is to actually like life is actually fucking amazing. It was all these games that were getting in the way of us realizing that.
Yeah. And
I use surprisingly little, if I'm being quite honest, relative.
The one thing you realize when you're a teacher too, and maybe you can understand as you have more and more of your cohorts, is that was it in Days and Confused they say I'm getting older and they stay the same age or whatever. Like they're the young people are still gonna be young. Like there's always new people and they don't know about the stories. They don't know about the science, and they need it. They need people who've had experience. They need to listen to podcasts. They need to learn from elders. And so I was so appreciative, and I'm constantly appreciative of the people that come to my class to talk to the young people, because I spend a lot of time thinking about pedagogy, having them lead discussions, having them create engagement with the community, and we do a journal club, which I really want them to think about methodology and outcomes. But what I find is the most important thing for my young students is to connect with people. That's the number one thing. And so bringing in people with so many stories and experiences. David Nicholls, who I talked about, he spoke to my class this Tuesday, and I mean, he's a legend. He's absolutely in the field of psychedelics. Everything, the mouse twitch model, the 5-HT2A, everything we know is so dependent on his work throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, even today, right? His son is doing stuff too. So for my students to connect, I feel like they want to go forward responsibly, and I know, you and I have talked. There's a level of connection that may be too much, right? So if I became like Timothy Leary and started handing out psychedelics in my class, I probably would lose my job, and it may not necessarily be the most responsible way forward, but that connection is important. So
Totally.
yeah.
David Nicholls, I got to meet him at the Telluride Mushroom Festival a bunch of years ago, and I was wearing one of my Psychedelics Today shirt that has inaccurate molecules all over it. And he was like, I know what that is. I don't know what these three are. Could you tell me? And I'm like, oh, God, come on. But he's such a sweetheart. It was so good to actually interact with him, and he is such a legend, and the legacy is going to be gigantic.
Well, and what's great about him too, he's turning 80 this year. He is still doing fabulous work. He is still working with his son Charles. They are still, his son Charles has found some really neat stuff about the anti-inflammatory effects of psychedelics, very serendipitously. If you can get Charles on your show, he's got incredible research too. But
I'm always blown away by everything I hear coming out of his world.
Yeah, yeah. And that's one of the things about teaching too that's hard. I'm a chemist, so I want to teach my students all about the chemistry. Let's look at the crystal structures of these things. Let's look at analogs. Let's look at understanding. If we shut down certain pathways, what happens. But I also need to bring in journalists and. Oh man, I've had a lot of people who've been on your show have been in my class. Shayla Love, who's done some fabulous journalistic work. She's spoken to my class. Courtney Barnes, who's an excellent lawyer. He's worked with the Decrim stuff in Denver in 2019. She came to class when she was down here for a conference. And it's just so great when my students can connect with people. I think that's really, I sometimes think of myself as, I say I'm a connector and a protector, because I want to connect them with the material and with people, and I want to protect them from, the snake oil salespeople and the fake shamans and the therapists that want to touch them instead of really help them, right? And that's all out there too. And we talk about that, we're not shy. I brought up in class what's been going on with Ben Sessa, especially because he came to that Candidelic that you and I spoke at. And, it's important to recognize that some people are drawn to psychedelics because they know there's a potential for the vulnerability of others and they want to exploit that. And so we get into everything, I don't want to shift into a negative here, but we do get into we do get into the dirtier side.
And let's just name that though too. Like there's so much, so many like really nasty stories. What I like to lean on is that traditional psychiatry, psychotherapy has, as far as we know, a higher incident rate of issues than psychedelics as we stand today. But that could be a function of scale. It could be a function of research setting where there's cameras always. There's some factors that could be skewing that. But yeah, like there are people that get predatory, for sure. And I we need to figure out how to sort that problem out. Or like how do we make it a group thing as opposed to like an easy scenario for people to predate on you? I think that's a really good one. Safety in numbers,
We,
perhaps.
we we talked about this week. So MindMed, publishes their phase 2 data on LSD for general anxiety, and then this is one of the first, publicized trials that did not use psychotherapy,
Mm-hmm.
and that needs to be a big discussion because, if we can remove the psychotherapist and still see effectiveness, it doesn't necessarily mean that you won't gain potential from using a psychotherapist, but maybe we can reduce, cost. Maybe we can reduce some of the unethical behavior by having this as a route, that researchers start to consider. And one of the things that we were talking with Garcia about yesterday was so many studies look at the effect of, like, take for instance the New England Journal of Medicine that looked at escitalopram versus what was it,
I think it
psilocybin.
was psilocybin. Yeah.
Yeah, they both had psychotherapy, and then they were comparing the drug. And the reality was that, and you look at it, the psychotherapy probably helps. What we need to kind of see now is, what about people who take the same drug with or without a psychotherapist? How long is there an effective difference? Is there a longer period with the therapist? Is it the type of psychotherapy? So I think reducing some of the abuse could come from having psychedelics with just a monitor that's really just there to make sure that there's no catastrophe, not necessarily to get involved with the healing, but just to make sure nothing wrong happens in the room.
Mm, yeah. Um, right. Like, how can we do it? There's so many ways, right? There's so many avenues we could take to improve safety here, and I think we are. It's always going to go slower than we want, but we are going to get better. Um, but yeah, so I want to go back to one other thing we chatted about before we started rolling was the difference in needs between somebody like a veteran or a therapist in terms of training versus like the undergrads. And we kind of covered it a little bit, but how do you like to approach that? Undergrads are totally fresh. Veterans have done some living.
Yeah, yeah. So when it comes to psychedelic education, and you and I are both doing it, and I think the people that are coming to you, they are usually more experienced. They may be looking for professional development. Young people that are in my classes are looking to just, sometimes they're just taking an elective and they see the name and it looks interesting. Sometimes they're exploring their careers. And so there's a need at the young age to kind of, harness the excitement and the wonder, and also to bring in the balance and the teaching them how to be evidence based in their approach. I think many of the young people that I work with don't know how to read with skepticism. Uh, if anything, I might be a leery, but with two E's instead of with an E and an A, right? I'm the professor who says, let's see what the data looks like. My students don't realize that they should look at the funding source in a research paper until they take my class, and that's these are like key things. So I think the difference really in the undergrad versus maybe professionals or vets is you got to remember they're young and they need guidance. They need guidance in how they read. They need guidance in how they see the world. Patience too, um, which may be something that I tests me sometimes, but yeah, like for instance, I have a student right now who I have them do an assignment to pick a 21st century researcher to present on, and she said, "Can I do Chance the Rapper?" And I said, I haven't really responded yet. I've been thinking about it because I have to decide how to go forward. I really want her to think about what is a researcher and who is doing work in different fields, whether it be social sciences, natural, physical, etc. Um, but she likes the fact that entertainers are part of the space, and she doesn't quite understand, maybe what the assignment is. So, working with somebody and saying, "Hey, let's think about what you're going to get out of this if you pick an entertainer versus a researcher. You might just find somebody who enjoys, taking them and has become creative from it. Has this person brought something to the field that somebody after them, and if maybe if she can convince me one way or the other, I'll accept it. But there's a lot of that. I'll give an assignment with a very clear prompt, and young people are sometimes I just want to do what I want to do. I want to pick people I like. uh, and I want them to know, like for instance, you guys, on your show you've had Stan Groff a few times, and I want them to know the beauty of the work that Groff did at Spring Grove, and and the years that he worked on breath work, and bringing back his work and his ideas. But they want to know about Chance the Rapper, and whoever's popular
Mm-hmm.
on TikTok right now.
Jeez. Yeah, it's such a dynamic thing, right?
Do you guys
And
have a TikTok? Is there a Psychedelic Today TikTok?
whew, it's tragically bad, but yeah. Yeah, we have it. I think I look at it like once every 3 months. So it's like that's kind of the level of attention it gets tragically. But I know that's where people are. Like
Yeah.
people are saying, like as we record this, I think just yesterday or the day before, there was some big news about the. It said pretty much if TikTok doesn't change hands to a non-Chinese holder, TikTok will be banned from America. So they're like kind of forcing a transaction to
Yeah.
make it like a non-Chinese company, which is interesting. So like it's never going to get really shut down. The value's too high for them to lose the American audience, I think, and
Yeah.
potentially EU later. But like I think it's going to be here for a while. I don't understand how to use it. I know there's so much in there. It's yeah. Yeah, let me talk about my walker or my cane next. But like,
Well, they banned TikTok on our campus,
oh, really?
but that just means that students can't use our Wi-Fi. They can still use their provider, but we can't use it on our screens.
That's
If
interesting.
they knew I'm talking about it, I'm sure Big Brother would be.
Oh shit.
Uh,
But it's interesting, right? Like, how does that restrict education? Like, you can't then say, like, "Hey, look at these 4 videos." At least through their network, you could potentially get it off of their network and then bring it in. But you'd have to, that's interesting. I don't like it when there's restrictions on educators or researchers. That's always a little problematic.
yeah, we see a lot of that, and I think what's funny is that the students see it too. The students are not
Mm-hmm.
unaware that they are in a system that sometimes gets controlled by whoever's in office in your state. For instance, with us, our state really wants students to graduate in 4 years and get a job. As a pre-health director, and I work with our pre-med, it takes them a little bit of time to get shadowing experience and scribing experience and research experience, and so some of them don't get it done in 4 years, and we have to sit there and kind of, hopefully the president won't watch this and get on my case, but we sometimes work case by case and say it's okay. We'll get you through. We'll work with you. We want you to get into medical school, whether it takes
Mm,
5 years, 6 years, whatever. Yeah.
yeah. Um. So I kind of want to talk about, and we don't have a ton of time left, but I kind of want to talk about what we chatted about a couple months ago, which was Timothy Leary and like what your perspectives are on the Timothy Leary thing. Like I've spent a lot of time on the Timothy Leary topic. I know a lot of his friends, um, and I'm a huge fanboy, right? But he was one of the first people to do this with probably far too much psychedelics in his system. Um, but also like the federal establishment, in my opinion, just somewhat arbitrarily picked him to be the next most hated person in the world. You know what I mean?
Right,
and that's hard.
It's an interesting thing too, because when we study that period of time, you had the pranksters and Kesey, who were also a big vocal psychedelic evangelist group,
Mm-hmm.
and Leary was sort of the East Coast while they were the West Coast, etc. But yeah, so the course has a big 20th century piece. There are some important parts about psychedelics in the 20th century, in particular Hoffman's synthesis of LSD, but the 60s in general, the students already come in knowing something happened in the 60s because they hear about it. It's the counterculture, right? Which even I don't like that term very much because I feel like it makes it seem like this was against what culture should have, and in reality, culture should absorb all of its facets. The I do have a test question that I use regularly that says provide an argument for whether or not Timothy Leary was a positive force or a negative force in the in the history of psychedelics. And it is fascinating to me because it requires the students
They write it out.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Awesome.
And
That's
I've made them
great.
write them with pen too. I don't have them type it because I'm afraid they're going to chat GPT it. Um, but I think it's important for them to think about the whole picture. Yeah, there was a Controlled Substance Act. Was it Leary's fault? He was involved. He was made, like you said, to be sort of public enemy number one. But that was really in the historical, relic. It was a scapegoat, right? It was the efforts to pay less attention to what was going on in Vietnam, to make the government look like they were doing something really good, while in the same token they were still dropping bombs in Southeast Asia. So, but he's so complex, right? I mean,
Oh yeah.
the things he went through.
It requires like a really nuanced thing, man. Like I've actually wanted to do a conference, just so we could get more literature on pros and cons from like real experts.
There was one documentary that I used to show in class, and while he was in his last days, at some point he's sitting with his nurse, and he said something like, "I've been a good boy," right? I've been a good boy,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like a very emotional moment where you realize maybe his whole life he was really struggling for attention because there was something he was missing since childhood, and there's something more complex to him than just being an anti-establishment type person.
Oh yeah. Like when you start reading his biographies, there was so much early tragedy, like an insane amount of early tragedy, and not to mention just how harsh the world was back then for humans. Not like it's any all that better right now, but like yeah, like having an alcohol habit, having like multiple partners kill themselves. Like I think that was the case. I'm not 100% on that, but it's brutal.
I tell this story too to my class because when Timothy Leary died, I remember I was with my grandmother.
Mm.
We heard it on the news, and I said, "Oh wow, Timothy Leary passed away," and she goes, "Good." And I thought to myself in the years later, like, my grandmother was an older generation
Hmm.
that believed what she was taught, believed what she heard, that this was the downfall of society. And,
Mm.
it's important for the young people to understand um, that he was made into more than maybe he really was. But that, on the same token, not to take away from our discussion on him, but I really want them to understand there were so many important people at that same time frame. Uh,
Yeah, he
you
was not
know,
the only one.
Walter Pankey, is probably more interesting in that he had his medical doctor, his doctorate, he had his divinity.
Hmm.
He was so um, multifaceted, and his work was really kind of the springboard for Roland Griffith's work, right? Like the mysticism of psychedelics. That was really what the 2006 Griffiths paper and the beginning of the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelics was all about. So that may be, overshadowing the Harvard, work that Leary did was people like Pankey. And then, of course, Richard Alpert, who a lot of my students, once they find out, that Alpert turned into Ram Dass and gave some excellent insight into this world for people to learn from, a lot of them really take to asking more questions about, who was Ram Dass and what did he leave for society?
Like, he clearly left the world a much better place. And like, that's, I think most people would not argue that around Ram Dass, but I think it's certainly still contested with Tim because, the politics, the escaping from prison multiple times. That's one of my favorite parts, by the way. Like, who escapes prison that many times? But
you know what? This may be what's so good about teaching about Timothy Leary is that there could be good and bad about everything in psychedelics, right? I mean, this is the etymology of the term, right? To fathom hell or soar angelic. This is really what psychedelics are. They are not the end all to every mental health issue. They're not the panacea. They are potentially amazing. They are also potentially damaging, and that's really the part of psychedelic education that's so critical. Talking about where Timothy Leary, I mean, without Leary, you probably would not have turned on most of the people doing the work right now. I think that's an important thing to say. But at the same time, maybe without him, you would have had the folks in the 50s and 60s like Groff and Bill Richards, having achieved more if they weren't shut down at the time.
Right. And who was scarier to the establishment, the merry pranksters or like the Leary style users? And that's a big question. And like, you could pin it on Tim because he was establishment, then turned to this other weird culture. Yeah, it's an interesting conversation, and totally.
Well, and then my students quickly pick up on people like Sidney Gottlieb and the folks behind MK Ultra who are really the problem, right? I mean, Kesey wouldn't be turned on if he wasn't going to these CIA-funded LSD sessions.
And he stole a bunch of government acid from those facilities too. Right. It's amazing.
And this is what's so fun. I mean, I know I'm probably repetitive in saying this, but when you teach this and you get to dig into how it's all intertwined, it's a fascinating historical thing to learn about, which makes it fun to teach. But young people will not get this anywhere else. There's not a psychedelic department, so I have to teach this course and hit the history, hit the chemistry, hit the ethics, hit the religious, hit the, all these different pieces, and hope that they will go off into the world and do something with it.
Yeah. So overall, are you so you're teaching about this stuff once in a while? You're pretty public about critiques, which is great. Some people need to be critical here. What is your hope? Like, do you expect to see psychedelics beyond MDMA included in the pharmacopoeia? Like, do you expect for there to be more legitimized religious use or recreational use, or how do you see it?
Oh, that's such a good question. My hopes is that I can help young people better understand the space. In terms of what do I hope legally and for the greater,
or expect, not even hope.
I definitely think decriminalization has got to be it's got to be the focus right now. I think we've got to stop sending people to jail because they're doing drugs. We have to help people. It's also a waste of tax dollars to have people behind bars that we're paying for because they had weed on them or LSD in their hands or whatever.
Yeah. And there's still kids going to sleep hungry in this country somehow. So,
right.
Yes.
The only thing I would say is, and this comes up a lot, is the medicalization model worries me because we have a pretty broken medical system in this country. And so when I see these Spravato commercials, I think to
You've seen
myself,
commercials?
yeah,
Oh
yeah.
my gosh, I had no idea.
I'll send you. I'll send. I took a
Please.
screenshot. I was watching like an NBA game and they had it on. I'm like, I need to get the phone out real quick, and you can even hear me like laughing when they're because they show it's like classic antidepressant commercials. You've got like
Yeah.
all the people like playing volleyball at a park, and then they're like. This could cause this. The side effects are like this. You might have suicidal ideation. It might have addiction potential, etc. And you're like, this is such a talk about dissociative. The video and the audio are dissociative. Um, no, I think I get a little nervous, right? Because I think our medical system is broken. What I don't want to see is psilocybin is only available for depressed people, and now everybody is looking for the medical card to say they're depressed, like people do with cannabis in the states that are still not legal. Right here in the
Mm-hmm.
state of Florida, you don't have legal cannabis like you guys in Colorado. What do you have? You have this freaking industry of medical cards, and it's as inane. Like it's not right. It's not what we need. We need to let people who want to smoke be able to do so if they're responsible and they're not
Mm-hmm.
harming others around them, etc. So with psychedelics, I'd like to see that there is a way forward for for both ritualistic use, for personal use, for the therapeutic context, but
Mm.
not get stolen, not have here's the patent for psilocybin, and if nobody else can get a hands on it, and um, yeah, that's my hope. My hope is that there's a way forward for everybody, all stakeholders that really want to be able to benefit from them.
I love that. And explore and benefit and whatever, right? So there's so much left to figure out here. Um,
And
and I think,
keep educating, keep having avenues for young people to learn responsible information.
yeah, absolutely. And yeah, appropriate discernment and appropriate excitement, right? Like, how do you get really critical on some aspects? You're like, you're going a little far with that, or is it a maybe? And how do we actually get to a true or false on that?
And I know we're running out of time, so I'm
Hmm.
gonna make sure that I show you gratitude because I think the
Mm.
work that you do is incredibly important. I think having people on the show with the various experiences, you have researchers, you have therapists, you have entertainers, you have educators, you have people of all different types that when people listen and learn from other people, they can better understand the space. And the hopes is that the more that we do things smart, and that means listening to people and not not just buying into the hype, not just trying to prohibit everything, but finding that middle ground where we're open to new ideas and also also careful with how we do things. And I'm staring at this. Yeah, I gotta show you this. I'm staring at this. This is from the Open Foundation, and I think it's always on my mind, right? It's like, having the young people. I'm proud of my young psychedelic students that are trying to go about this the right way. And if you and I had these classes when we were kids, we would have taken them.
My life would have been quite different. Yeah. And that's why we started, right? Like, college kids are having a hard time. They're using anyway. Give them some fucking context and some sort of ground so they don't get super lost in the clouds. That's a big one. Yeah. We
Absolutely.
need less fallout in this world. So this is one way to do it. All right,
Absolutely.
Joey, thank you so much. Where can people find more about what you do?
I am the worst when it comes to socials. I think I'm on LinkedIn and I have a Facebook, but I'm so busy grading papers that you will find me, on FIU's campus, or I do run a lot of ultra marathons, so you might find me running around in some trails somewhere. But otherwise, I don't really have much. I'm just a teacher trying to teach. I don't have anything to sell.
Right on, Joey. I hope we can do it more. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Joe.